My name is Maya Sterling. For the world, the Sterling name is synonymous with Ethelgard Pharmaceuticals, the giant that owns the patents to your pain and the cure for your fever. My father, Arthur Sterling, built this empire on a single philosophy: profit is the only sustainable cure. I was groomed to be his successor, the cold-eyed CEO who would protect the margins. But I chose a different lab. I spent my nights in the forgotten districts, developing low-cost generics for people who had to choose between insulin and rent. When my father found out I was leaking proprietary chemical structures to nonprofits, he didn't just fire me, he erased me. "You have the heart of a saint and the brain of a traitor," he told me the night he struck me from his will. He stripped me of my inheritance, my titles, and my access to the Sterling Labs, leaving me with nothing more than a crumbling basement clinic in the slums. But science has a funny way of leveling the playing field. While Ethelgard focused on high-priced lifestyle drugs, a silent killer was mutating in the shadows, a rare neurodegenerative condition called V12 syndrome. And, as it turns out, the only person who has spent the last 5 years studying its unique protein fold isn't a high-paid corporate scientist. It's the daughter he left in the dust. Now, the king of pharma is dying, and the only dose of the cure in existence is sitting in my humble, hand-built centrifuge. This isn't just about medicine anymore. It's about a hostile takeover of a human soul. The boardrooms of Ethelgard are situated on the 80th floor, high above the smog and the suffering. From there, people look like data points on a spreadsheet. My father, Arthur, loved that view. He believed that distance was the key to objectivity. But I always preferred the microscope, because when you look close enough, you can't ignore the flaws in the design. The day I was disinherited wasn't dramatic. There were no raised voices, only the clinical scratching of a fountain pen against parchment. My father sat behind his obsidian desk, the late afternoon sun casting long, sharp shadows across the room. "You've been seen in the East District again, Maya, distributing Sterling-grade antibiotics for the price of a loaf of bread. Do you have any idea what that does to our brand positioning?" "It keeps children from dying of preventable infections, Father," I replied, my lab coat still smelling of the cheap disinfectant from the clinic. Arthur looked up finally. His eyes were like blue ice, beautiful but utterly devoid of heat. "It's not about the pennies, it's about the principle. Ethelgard creates value. Value must be protected. By giving away our research, you are devaluing the very foundation of this family. You are a leak, Maya, and leaks must be plugged." He pushed a folder toward me. It was the Disinheritance and Non-Disclosure Agreement. It stripped me of my 15% stake in the company, my trust fund, and even the right to use the Sterling name in any professional medical capacity. "Sign it," he said. "Go play doctor in the dirt. See how long your conscience lasts when you can't afford the electricity for your incubators." I signed it without a word. I didn't need his gold to understand biology. I walked out of the Sterling Tower with nothing but my personal research journals and a single battered centrifuge I had bought with my own savings. I moved to a basement in the gray zone, a part of the city where the ambulances rarely go. My laboratory was a patchwork of salvaged equipment and black market reagents. While the rest of the world looked for the next blockbuster weight loss pill, I became obsessed with V12. It started as a rumor in the clinics, a rapid onset paralysis that bypassed the immune system. The big pharma companies ignored it because it only affected the low-income demographics. There was no profit in a cure for the poor. For 3 years, I lived on caffeine and the adrenaline of discovery. I saw patients that Ethelgard had turned away because their insurance wasn't premium. I watched them wither, and I promised them I would find the key. I discovered that V12 wasn't just a virus, it was a protein misfolding disease triggered by environmental toxins, the very toxins produced by Ethelgard's unregulated chemical plants in the East District. My father wasn't just ignoring the disease, his greed was creating it. I worked in total anonymity. I was the zero scientist, the one who didn't exist in the journals, but I found it, a synthetic peptide that could refold the proteins and reverse the paralysis. I called it the anchor. But I could only produce it in microdoses. I didn't have the industrial bioreactors of the Ethelgard Tower. I had a glass jar and a prayer. Then the news broke. Ini, Arthur Sterling, titan of industry, diagnosed with a rare neurological disorder. The irony was a bitter pill. The very disease my father's factories had leaked into the slums had finally climbed the elevator to the 80th floor. V12 didn't care about brand positioning. It didn't care about net worth. It had found its way into the king's blood. Ethelgard's stock plummeted. Their top scientists scrambled, but they were decades behind. They had spent their time on maintenance drugs, not curative science. They were looking for a fire extinguisher, while I was sitting on the only ocean of water in the world. A week later, a black limousine pulled up to my basement clinic. A man in a $3,000 suit stepped out into the mud of the gray zone. It was Marcus Torn, my father's chief of staff. "Maya," his voice said, his voice tight with desperation, "your father he's failing. The doctors say he has 48 hours before the respiratory failure begins. We know you've been working on something. We've seen your data on the underground servers." I told him to go play doctor in the dirt, Marcus. I told him my conscience was a liability. Why should I help a man who thinks my work has no value? "He'll pay anything, Maya. Name your price. 10 million? 100? He'll reinstate you. You'll be the richest woman in medicine." I looked at the hungry, tired people waiting in line outside my clinic, people who had been poisoned by Arthur Sterling's factories. "I don't want his money," I said, my voice as cold as the ice in his eyes. "Tell him I'll come to the tower, but I'm not coming as a daughter. I'm coming as a liquidator. If he wants the cure, he has to sign over every asset, every patent, and every cent of the Sterling fortune to the Global Health Trust."
My dear ones, thank you for listening to this story. It makes me incredibly happy to feel that you are here with me. I try my best for you and post new videos every day, putting a piece of myself into them. If my stories resonate with you, your subscription and viewing of other videos will be the warmest support for me and inspiration to continue telling stories.
Walking back into the Sterling Tower felt like entering a vacuum. The air was too clean, the light too bright, and the silence was heavy with the scent of expensive panic. 3 years ago, I was escorted out of these glass doors by security. Today, the board of directors stood in a line, bowing their heads as I passed. They didn't see a doctor. They saw a life raft in a sinking sea of stock options. I was led to the penthouse medical suite, a room that cost more per night than my clinic's entire annual budget. My father lay in the center of a web of tubes and glowing monitors. The titan of pharma looked fragile, his skin the color of parchment, his eyes darting frantically as the paralysis crept toward his chest. "Maya," he wheezed, the word barely a vibration. "You came?" "I came to collect a debt, Father," I said, setting my battered medical kit on the pristine white counter. I didn't touch him. I didn't offer a daughter's comfort. I pulled out a single syringe filled with the blue-glowing anchor peptide. "The board tells me you have 30 hours left before your diaphragm stops moving. Your scientists have tried everything, haven't they? They tried the high-margin antivirals. They tried the patented neuroblockers. But they couldn't find the cure because they refused to look at the cause. Marcus Thorne stepped forward, flanked by 3 men in dark suits holding leather briefcases. The lawyers have reviewed your terms, Maya. Transferring the entire Ethelgard asset portfolio to a public trust it's unprecedented. It's corporate suicide. We're prepared to offer you a 51% controlling interest and a $1 billion bonus instead. You're still bargaining, I said, turning to face them. I held the syringe over a biohazard disposal bin. This peptide is chemically volatile. It requires a specific harmonic frequency from my portable centrifuge to stay active. If you take it by force, it becomes a useless slurry of amino acids in 60 seconds. I am the only one who knows the stabilization sequence. I am the only one who can keep him breathing. The room was silent, save for the rhythmic hiss of the ventilator. My father's eyes were fixed on me, filled with a primal, desperate fear. He had spent his life winning. He didn't know how to handle a loss this absolute. "Sign," choked Arthur, the effort causing the monitors to spike. "Sign it all." The hawk-like lawyer hesitated, then opened the briefcase. One by one, the documents were laid out on the overbed table. The transfer of the Sterling family estate, the dissolution of the private patents, the reclassification of Ethelgard as a non-profit entity dedicated to the Global Health Trust. I watched as Marcus Thorne guided my father's trembling hand to sign the electronic pad. With each signature, a $1 billion empire crumbled. With each signature, the medicine became a little more affordable for the people in the gray zone. "It's done," Marcus said, hollow. "The Sterling fortune is gone. Are you satisfied?" "Not yet," I said. I stepped to the bedside and leaned down, whispering so only my father could hear. "Do you want to know why you're sick, Father? Your doctors called it a rare mutation, but I ran the sequencing in my basement. V12 syndrome is caused by long-term exposure to ethyl dioxin, the byproduct of the cheap filtration systems you installed in the East District plants to save 4% on overhead. You poisoned the city to pad your pockets, and the wind carried that poison right back to your penthouse. You didn't just catch a disease, you manufactured it." The look on his face wasn't just pain, it was the realization that his entire philosophy had been a suicide note. I injected the first dose of the anchor into his IV line. Almost instantly, the blue glow began to spread through his veins, visible beneath his thin skin. The monitors stabilized, the frantic gasping slowed. "The first dose will stop the progression," I announced to the room. "But the reversal process takes 7 days. I will be staying here, in this suite. No Ethelgard staff, no private doctors. If any of you try to interfere, if any of you try to move a single cent out of the trust, the treatment stops. I am the only doctor he has now." I turned away from the bed and looked out at the city. From up here, the gray zone was just a patch of darkness in the distance, but soon the lights of the Sterling Tower would be used to illuminate the lives of the people down there. "Maya," whispered Arthur, his voice slightly stronger, "why save me if you hate everything I am?" "Because unlike you, Father, I don't put a price on a soul. And because I want you to live long enough to see the world you built be torn down, brick by brick, and replaced by something human. You're not my father anymore. You're just patient zero, and I have a lot to learn from your failure."
Power is a hallucination that only exists as long as everyone agrees to believe in it.
For decades, the board of Ethelgard believed they were the gods of the city, but when I pulled the financial plug, the lights started to flicker. They didn't see a daughter saving her father. They saw a terrorist dismantling their dividends, and they were ready to kill to keep the status quo. The third day of treatment began with a warning, not from a doctor, but from the stock market. The moment the news of the Global Health Trust leak hit the wires, Ethelgard's shares didn't just drop, they vanished. The pharma king was being cannibalized by his own sharks. "Maya, you have to stop this," Marcus Thorne hissed, bursting into the medical suite. Outside the reinforced glass doors, I could see groups of men in tactical gear, private security hired by the board, not the family. "The board has filed an emergency injunction. They're claiming Arthur was under duress and neurologically compromised when he signed the transfer. They've frozen the servers. Your trust is a ghost until a judge rules on it." "Then I guess it's a good thing I didn't rely on the servers," I said, checking the IV drip. My father was awake now, his eyes tracking our conversation with a terrifying clarity. He could hear everything, but his voice was still a raspy ghost. "The physical deeds are already with the International Health Commission, and as for duress, I'm the only one keeping his heart beating. If that's duress, then every doctor in history is a kidnapper." The tension snapped at noon. The board cut the power to the penthouse, hoping to force me out when the life support systems switched to batteries. They thought I was a pampered scientist who would fold under pressure. They didn't know about the Grey Guard. While the elevators were being locked down, I picked up a low-frequency radio, the kind we used in the slums to avoid police sweeps. "Leo, it's time," I said. 10 minutes later, the street level of the Sterling Tower was swarmed, not by protesters with signs, but by thousands of residents from the East District and the Gray Zone. These were the people Ethelgard had poisoned, the families who had lost everything to the V12 virus. They formed a human wall around the building, thousands deep, blocking the private security teams from entering or leaving. "What is this?" Marcus shouted, looking down from the 80th floor at the massive crowd. "An uprising?" "It's a stakeholders meeting, Marcus," I said, walking to the bed. "And for the first time, the real stakeholders are in charge." I turned to my father. I could see the sweat on his brow. The first phase of the anchor felt like fire as the proteins were forced back into their correct shapes. "You're watching them, aren't you, Father?" I asked, pointing to the window. "Those are the people you called collateral damage in your quarterly reports. Now, they are the only reason the board hasn't sent a strike team through that door. They're protecting me because I'm the only one who cares if they live. And I'm protecting you because you're the only one who can testify against the board." "Maya, the files, drawer 4, he whispered, his hand twitching, a sign of returning motor function. I opened the concealed drawer in his bedside console. Inside was a black encrypted drive, separate from the corporate network. "The board didn't just know about the dioxin," Arthur choked out, each word a battle. "They funded the cover-up. They have a second virus, V13, a targeted strain for the overseas markets. They wanted a permanent customer base." My blood turned to ice. V12 was an accident of greed. V13 was a strategy of genocide. "You were going to release it?" I asked, my voice trembling with a mix of horror and disgust. "I refused," he said, his eyes tearing up. "That's why they poisoned me. I wasn't patient 0, Maya. I was the first target." Suddenly, the reinforced doors of the suite groaned. A heavy industrial drill was biting through the titanium lock. The board wasn't waiting for a judge. They were coming for the drive, and they were coming to make sure Arthur didn't survive the night.
"Marcus, get the emergency crash cart and the portable centrifuge," I commanded. "What are you doing?" "We're leaving," I said. "We can't hold this suite. If they get inside, they'll just accidentally unplug his vitals and blame the protesters. We're going down to the gray zone. We're going to the one place where they have no power." "The basement?" Marcus looked horrified. "He'll die in that filth." "He'll die in this luxury in 10 minutes. In the basement, he has 1,000 people ready to die for him, not for who he is, but for what I'm making him do." I disconnected the heavy monitors and hooked my father up to the portable life support unit I had built in the slums. It was ugly, made of salvaged parts and exposed wires, but it was resilient. As the drill broke through the door and the first flashbang grenade detonated in the foyer, we slipped into the service elevator. I hit the button for the sub-basement. The descent was a blur of silence and the rhythmic thump-thump of the elevator cable. When the doors opened, we weren't in a lobby. We were in the loading docks where a modified delivery van was waiting, guarded by Leo and a dozen men with industrial respirators. "Is he the one who poisoned my sister?" Leo asked, looking at the pale man on the stretcher. "He's the one who's going to pay for her treatment, Leo," I said. "Get him in. We have a war to win, and the lab is the only battlefield left." As the van sped away from the Sterling Tower, I looked back. The 80th floor was engulfed in smoke. The board had reclaimed the glass, but I had the king, I had the cure, and I had the evidence.
The contrast was absolute. 3 hours ago, we were surrounded by Italian marble and automated climate control. Now, the only sound was the dripping of a leaky pipe and the hum of a diesel generator. My father lay on a rusted hospital bed, the flickering fluorescent lights of my basement clinic casting skeletal shadows on his face. This wasn't a room for a billionaire, but it was the only place on Earth where he was actually safe. "Maya?" Arthur's voice was a dry rattle. He was looking at the peeling paint on the ceiling, his hands clutching the rough wool blanket. "This is where you've been?" "This is the front line, Father," I said, snapping on a pair of latex gloves. I began drawing a fresh sample of his blood. The blue glow of the anchor was fading, being replaced by a dark, sluggish crimson. The V13 strain was starting to react to the cure. "You spent millions on corporate social responsibility ads showing happy children in green fields. This is the reality. People here die of infections because the patents on your basic antibiotics are too high, and now your board wants to release something even worse." I moved to my primary workstation, a collection of hacked Sterling hardware and custom-built bioreactors. I needed to isolate the V13 sequence from Arthur's serum. If the board had truly engineered a targeted pandemic, the seed of the antidote was buried in the very poison they used to silence him. "Marcus, status report," I called out without looking away from the microscope. "The building is secure," Leo replied, leaning against the heavy iron door. He was wearing a tactical vest, a radio clipped to his shoulder. "The Grey Guard has blocked the 3 main entrances to the block. The police are staying away for now. They don't want a riot in a district they can't control. But we've spotted Raven security drones circling the perimeter. The board is looking for a heat signature. Mask the vents with the cooling fans and tell the community leaders we need more ice. If the bioreactor overheats, we lose the sequence." The digital war was just as intense. Marcus Thorne was hunched over a laptop, his face illuminated by the scrolling red text of the Aethelgard internal security bypass. "They've wiped your credentials, Maya, and they're erasing the V13 project files from the main server as we speak. If we don't grab the data now, it'll be like the virus never existed. They'll release it, call it a natural mutation, and sell the world a subscription-based vaccine." Use the drive my father gave me. I pointed to the black encrypted device. It's a physical kill switch backup. He built it as an insurance policy against his own board. He knew they were Vipers. He just didn't expect them to strike so soon. As Marcus worked, I watched my father. He was watching the door. A young girl, no older than 6, had wandered into the lab area. Her name was Elena, and her mother was one of the many victims of the initial V12 leak. She didn't know who Arthur Sterling was. She just saw a tired, sick old man. She walked up to the bed and placed a small, wilted flower on his blanket. "For the sick man," she whispered, before running back to her mother. For the first time in my life, I saw my father cry, not the calculated tears of a press conference, but the silent, heavy tears of a man realizing the weight of his sins. "I thought they were just statistics," Arthur choked out, his eyes fixed on the flower. "I never saw the faces." "That's how you built the empire, Father, by making sure the faces were invisible. But now, you are one of them. You're a statistic in your own ledger." "Maya, I'm in!" Marcus shouted. The laptop screen exploded with data, blueprints for a chemical distribution network, shipping manifests for agricultural fertilizers that were actually aerosolized viral loads, and the list of political figures who had been bribed to stay silent. It was the blueprint for a global coup disguised as a medical emergency. "They're planning to release it in 48 hours, Marcus said, horror dawning on his face. "During the World Health Summit in Geneva, they'll infect the delegates, start the spread, and offer the Sterling response as the only solution." "Not if we release the Sterling truth first," I said. I looked at the vial in my hand. The V13 antidote was stabilizing. It was clear, pure, and infinitely valuable. But it wasn't enough to just have the cure. We had to destroy the profit motive. "Leo, get the pirate broadcast equipment ready. We're not going through the mainstream media. They're owned by the same hedge funds that own Ethelgard. We're going to hit every screen in the city, every billboard, every smartphone, every terminal. We're going to show them the face of the Pharma King telling the truth from a basement in the gray zone." Suddenly, the generator sputtered, the lights flickered and died, the hum of the bioreactor stopped. "The drones!" Leo hissed, looking at his monitor. "They didn't find us. They hit the local power substation. They're blacking out the whole district to scramble our signal." "Switch to the manual pumps," I yelled. "Leo, give me your flashlight. We can't let the serum settle." In the sudden, suffocating darkness, we worked by the light of a dozen handheld torches. I was pumping the centrifuge by hand, the rhythmic clack, clack, clack of the gears echoing like a countdown. "You have to go," Arthur whispered, struggling to sit up. "They want the drive. If they kill me, it doesn't matter. Save the people." "I'm not leaving you, and I'm not leaving the science. You're going to live to sign the final dissolution papers, Father. You're going to watch the Ethelgard logo be scraped off the side of that tower." The sound of a heavy engine rumbled outside. Not a van, an armored personnel carrier. The board was done with drowns. They had sent the Raven ground team. "They're at the door," Leo shouted, racking his weapon. "The broadcast," I screamed at Marcus. "Is it ready?" 90% uploaded. I need 2 more minutes." "I'll give you 2 minutes," I said, grabbing a flare gun from the emergency kit. "Father, stay still. Leo, follow me. We're going to show them that the gray zone doesn't just produce victims, it produces survivors." I burst out of the clinic into the rainy street. The armored car was a black beast, its spotlights blindingly bright. "Maya Sterling," a voice boomed from the vehicle, "surrender the assets and the patient, or we will authorize lethal force. You have 10 seconds."
I looked at the thousands of people standing behind me in the shadows, men, women, and children who had nothing left to lose. I held the flare gun high. I don't have your assets. I have your obituary. I fired the flare. As the red light illuminated the sky, the billboards across the city suddenly flickered to life, not with ads, but with the face of Arthur Sterling, recorded 10 minutes ago, confessing to the V13 conspiracy.
My dear ones, thank you for listening to this story. It makes me incredibly happy to feel that you are here with me. I try my best for you and post new videos every day, putting a piece of myself into them. If my stories resonate with you, your subscription and viewing of other videos will be the warmest support for me and inspiration to continue telling stories.
The air in the basement was thick with the smell of ozone and desperation. The red glare of the flare I had fired was still burning in my retinas, but the real fire was just beginning. Across the city, millions were watching my father's face on their screens, hearing the confession that would dismantle a trillion-dollar industry. But the Raven tactical team outside didn't care about public opinion. They were paid to silence the source. Target acquired, deploying gas. A voice muffled by a respirator barked from outside the clinic doors. "Leo, SEALs!" I screamed. We slammed the heavy industrial shutters just as the hiss of canisters echoed in the alleyway. They weren't using tear gas. My sensors picked up the signature of a fast-acting sedative, Ethelgard's own sleepwalker compound. They wanted us alive just long enough to retrieve the encrypted drive and the antidote. Then we would be victims of the very chaos we supposedly started. "I can't breathe," Marcus gasped, clutching his throat. "Mask up, now." I handed out the respirators we had modified in the gray zone. I moved to my chemical bench. I didn't have flashbangs or bullets, but I had the periodic table. I mixed a solution of concentrated acetic acid with a stabilized peroxide base. If they wanted a chemical war, I would give them a lesson in vapor pressure. I poured the mixture into the ventilation intake backwards. A thick, white cloud of non-toxic but blindingly pungent vapor billowed out of the clinic's exterior vents, engulfing the Raven team. I heard coughing, cursing, and the sound of heavy boots stumbling over the debris I had strategically placed in the alleyway. "Leo, is the upload finished?" I yelled over the roar of the generator, which had finally kicked back in. 100%. The V13 blueprints and the corruption files are on every major open-source server from Berlin to Tokyo, Marcus shouted, his eyes wide behind his goggles. "But Maya, look at the internal monitoring for the East District plants." I looked at the screen. A series of red icons were flashing on the map of the Ethelgard chemical refinery. Emergency purge initiated. Pressure override active. "They're going to blow the tanks," I whispered, the blood draining from my face. "They're not just destroying the evidence, they're creating a distraction so big that the news cycle will forget the confession. If those tanks go, the East District becomes a crater." "Maya," Arthur's voice was stronger now, bolstered by the second dose of the anchor. He was sitting up, his face etched with a newfound painful clarity. "The override code. It's not in the main system. It's a physical, manual lever in the central hub. They built it to be tamper-proof." "I have to go there," I said, already grabbing my bag. "You'll never get through the perimeter," Leo said, checking his rifle. "The whole district is a war zone. Raven teams are everywhere." "Then we don't go through the perimeter," I said, looking at the floor. "We go under it." The gray zone was built on top of the old Sterling drainage tunnels, the same tunnels that carried the toxins away from the rich and into the lungs of the poor. I had spent years mapping them to smuggle medicine. "Leo, you and the Grey Guards stay here. Protect the clinic. Protect the serum. If I don't make it back, you distribute the antidote to the hospitals, no matter what."
The tunnels were a nightmare of slime and narrow passages. Every breath felt like inhaling liquid lead, but I had a map in my head and fury in my heart. I emerged 10 minutes later inside the perimeter of the East District refinery, a forest of rusted pipes and hissing steam. The alarms were screaming, a long, mournful wail that signaled the end. The pressure gauges on the central tank were already in the red. "Stop right there, doctor." I froze. Standing on the catwalk above me was Dr. Holloway, Aethelgard's head of research, the man who had mentored me before I chose the slums. He was holding a remote detonator. "Holloway, don't do this," I said, slowly raising my hands. "You swore an oath." "I swore an oath to progress, Maya," he shouted, his voice cracking. "The board promised us immortality. V13 was the key. We were going to transcend the human immune system. But you and your ethics, you've ruined 40 years of work." "You're not transcending anything, Holloway. You're just a glorified hitman for a group of billionaires who would replace you with an algorithm in a heartbeat. Look at the gauges. You're standing on top of a bomb." "If the board goes down, everything goes down," Holloway shouted, his thumb hovering over the button. I didn't argue. I didn't beg. I used the only thing Holloway respected: superior chemistry. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small glass orb filled with a hyper-saturated potassium solution. I threw it not at him, but at the high-pressure steam valve behind him. The explosion was small but precise. The steam valve ruptured, dousing the catwalk in a blinding, scalding mist. Holloway screamed, dropping the detonator as he scrambled back. I lunged for the manual override lever. It was red, heavy, and coated in years of neglect. I threw my entire weight against it. Crank, crank, crack. The sound of the pressure being diverted was like a thunderclap. The screaming alarms shifted to a low, rhythmic hum. The red lights on the tanks flickered to amber, then green. The purge had been neutralized. I slumped against the lever, gasping for air. Holloway was curled in a ball, his hands burned, sobbing about the legacy. I picked up his radio. "This is Maya Sterling to Aethelgard Command. The East District hasn't been erased. The documents are live. The police are at your gates. And I'm coming back to the tower to witness the funeral of your greed." I made my way back to the surface just as the sun began to peek through the smog of the East District. The Raven teams were retreating, their comms filled with reports of the board members being intercepted at the airport by federal agents. When I returned to the clinic, the Grey Guard was cheering. Leah was standing at the door, a grin breaking through the soot on his face. But when I entered the lab, I saw Arthur standing by the window. He was weak, leaning on a crutch, but he was standing on his own. "It's over, Maya," he said, looking at the city. "The board is being dismantled. The trust is active." "It's just the beginning, Father," I said, putting my hand on his shoulder. "Now comes the hard part. We have to clean up the mess you made."
Geneva in March was a symphony of cold lake winds and the sharp smell of old money. The United Nations headquarters, with its rows of flags and marble facades, felt like a cathedral of order. But as I stepped off the small, unmarked plane with my father and Marcus, I knew that beneath the diplomatic poise, the world was holding its breath. We weren't just here to talk. We were here to perform a live-streamed exorcism of the pharmaceutical industry. "Maya, the Interpol Red Notice is still active," Marcus whispered, his eyes scanning the security detail at the VIP entrance. "The board's lawyers have spent the last 12 hours painting you as a biological extremist. If we step inside that hall, they might arrest you before you can even open your medical kit." "Let them try," I said, clutching the reinforced briefcase containing the stabilized V13 antidote. The Grey Guard is broadcasting the data from the Sterling servers to every news outlet in Europe. If they touch me, it'll be the most watched human rights violation in history. My father, Arthur, was in a wheelchair, his face gaunt, but his gaze piercing. He wore a simple suit, stripped of the gold pins and diamond cufflinks of his former life. He looked like a man who had finally seen the bottom of the abyss and decided to climb out. As we entered the General Assembly Hall, a hush fell over the room. Hundreds of health ministers, scientists, and heads of state turned to look at the outcast of Æthelgard. At the podium stood Julian Vane, the chairman of the board, the man who had signed the order for my father's disposal. "Distinguished delegates," Vane said, his voice amplified by the massive speakers, "do not be deceived by this theatrical arrival. Maya Sterling is carrying an unverified, highly dangerous biological agent. We have reason to believe she has already infected the East District of her home city to create a demand for her cure. She is a predator, not a physician." "The only predator in this room is the one who puts a price tag on a heartbeat, Julian," I shouted, my voice echoing through the vaulted chamber. I didn't wait for an invitation. I walked straight to the secondary podium. "I have the sequencing data here," I said, slamming the encrypted drive onto the reader. "This data doesn't come from a terrorist cell. It comes from the Sterling Tower. It details the creation of V13, a virus designed to be resistant to all current Sterling patented antivirals. A virus that, as we speak, is being circulated through the HVAC system of this very building." Chaos erupted. Security guards moved toward the vents, while delegates began to panic, covering their faces with scarves and masks. "She's lying!" Vane screamed, his face turning a dark, mottled purple. "Is it?" I asked, looking at the sensor on my briefcase. It was blinking red. "My sensors have just detected the aerosolized protein markers of V13 in the air. In approximately 4 hours, everyone in this room will begin to experience the first stage of neurological collapse. You wanted a permanent customer base, Julian? Well, you just made the leaders of the free world your first patients." The panic turned into a cold, terrifying silence. The security teams froze, looking at each other, then at the vents. No one wanted to be the one to touch me now. I was the only person with the map to the exit. "The antidote is in this case," I continued, my voice steady, "but I will not give it to you, not yet. I will only release the formula and the doses once the Geneva Protocol is signed, an international mandate that abolishes private patents on life-saving medicines and establishes a global non-profit manufacturing network." "You're extorting the world!" a minister shouted from the floor. "No," I countered, "I am making the world sign the same contract my father signed. I am liquidating the greed that made this virus possible. If you want to live, you have to agree that everyone else has the right to live too." My father, Arthur, spoke up, his voice carried by the open microphone. "Julian, stop," he whispered. "It's over. I was the first target. I saw the children's faces in the gray zone. You can't buy your way out of a mirror." Suddenly, a woman in the third row, the health minister of a small African nation, collapsed. Her hands began to shake uncontrollably, the classic first sign of V13. "It's starting," I said, opening the briefcase. "I have enough doses here for the first responders, but the formula is the real cure. Sign the protocol, and I upload it to the public domain. Refuse, and we all stay here and watch the lights go out together."
The president of the assembly, a man known for his rigid adherence to procedure, looked at the collapsing minister, then at the monitors showing the global stock markets in a total meltdown. He picked up the ceremonial pen. "This is not diplomacy," he said, his hand trembling. "It's a revolution." "It's medicine, Mr. President," I replied. "It was never supposed to be anything else." As he signed the document, I hit the broadcast button. The formula for the V13 antidote, the culmination of my 3 years in the dirt and the blood, raced across the fiber optic cables of the world. It was free. It was public. It was no longer a sterling asset. But as the first doses were being administered to the delegates, Julian Vane slipped out of a side door. He wasn't going for a plane. He was going for the central filtration hub of the building. "Maya, the sensors!" Marcus shouted. "The concentration of V13 in the air is spiking. He's dumping the entire reserve into the system. He's trying to kill everyone before the antidote can take effect." I grabbed a respirator and a preloaded syringe. "Stay with my father. Get the delegates to the lower levels." I ran toward the maintenance tunnels of the Palais. I could hear Vane's footsteps echoing above me. He wasn't a businessman anymore. He was a suicide bomber with a viral payload. I found him in the heart of the ventilation hub, standing over a massive, hissing, pressurized tank. He had a gun in his hand. "You think you won, Maya?" He laughed, the sound muffled by his own high-grade respirator. "Ethelgard was my life. If it dies, everything dies with it." "The world doesn't belong to your company, Julian," I shouted, ducking behind a heavy steel pillar as a bullet whizzed past. I didn't have a gun. I had a syringe and a knowledge of the human nervous system. I knew that the V13 virus, in high concentrations, was incredibly sensitive to sudden changes in temperature. I reached for the liquid nitrogen coolant line that ran along the wall. With a desperate heave, I ruptured the valve. A jet of sub-zero gas blasted into the room, instantly freezing the aerosolized virus and creating a wall of white mist. Vane screamed as the cold hit him, his finger slipping on the trigger. I moved through the mist like a ghost. I didn't kill him. I injected him with a concentrated dose of the antidote directly into his carotid artery. The shock of the cure meeting the virus in his system knocked him unconscious. The tank hissed, then fell silent. The fans slowed. The air began to clear. I walked back to the assembly hall. The delegates were recovering, the blue glow of the cure visible in their veins. The Geneva Protocol was signed. The Sterling Empire was gone. I sat down on the floor next to my father's wheelchair, exhausted, my lab coat covered in frost and grime. "We did it, Maya," he whispered, taking my hand. "The people are safe." "For now, Father," I said, looking at the row of flags. "But the archive of greed is deep. We've just cleared the first floor."
The Sterling Tower still looms over the city, a skeletal monument to a dead era. But the real danger isn't in the glass halls anymore. It's in the dead zones, the industrial outskirts where Ethelgard's automated ghost factories are still running. They were designed to operate without human intervention, self-correcting systems that optimized profit by cutting corners on safety. Now, without a central command, they are stuck in a feedback loop, pumping toxic precursors into the groundwater at an accelerating rate. I sat in the back seat of a battered medical van, checking the oxygen levels in my father's portable tank. We weren't headed for a luxury hotel or a secure government bunker. We were headed for the heart of the East District. "Maya, the sensors are off the charts," Marcus said from the front seat, his voice muffled by a heavy-duty respirator. The atmospheric sulfur concentration is 400% above the lethal limit for children. If we don't shut down the primary Stirling 7 reactor, the entire district will be uninhabitable by morning." "The board left a scorched earth protocol," I replied, tightening the straps of my own mask. "They locked the encryption keys. The only way to stop the purge is a physical handshake at the core terminal. The system needs the biometrics of a senior executive." I looked at my father. He was looking at his hands, the same hands that had signed the orders to build these automated graveyards. We reached the gates of Stirling 7. It was a fortress of rusted steel and humming high-voltage wires. There were no guards, only the cold, mechanical efficiency of the automated turrets that guarded the proprietary interests. "Leo, can your team mask our thermal signature?" I asked over the radio. "We're trying, Maya, but these turrets are tuned to detect any carbon-based life form. The board didn't want anyone, not even the workers, getting near the secret ingredients of the V-series." "Then we go in under a shield," I said. We used a reinforced lead-lined transport container pushed by a salvaged forklift. As the bullets of the automated turrets sparked off the metal, I felt my father's hand grip mine. He wasn't afraid of the bullets. He was afraid of the silence of the machines he had created. Inside, the factory was a cathedral of madness. Massive vats of fluorescent green sludge bubbled and hissed, while robotic arms moved with terrifying speed, packaging medicine that was actually concentrated poison. The air was a thick yellow fog. "The terminal is on the 3rd level," Arthur wheezed, his voice coming through the comms in my helmet. "Maya, the access port, it's behind the pressure valves." We reached the core. The air was vibrating with the sheer force of the misfiring reactor. I pushed my father's wheelchair to the biometric scanner. A red light scanned his iris, then his palm. "Access denied. User status deceased/terminated." The board marked him as dead the moment he signed the Geneva Protocol, I cursed, hitting the console. "They've overwritten his biological signature. The system doesn't recognize the king anymore." "There is a secondary bypass," Arthur whispered, struggling to stand. He pointed to a small shielded alcove near the heat exchanger. "The founder's key. It's not digital, it's mechanical, but the temperature is too high." The alcove was surrounded by a wall of superheated steam. It was a suicide mission for anyone without a high-grade radiation suit, which we didn't have. "I'll go," I said, grabbing a fire-retardant blanket and drenching it in coolant. "No, Maya," Arthur said, his voice suddenly firm, carrying a weight I hadn't heard in years. He wasn't wheezing, he was commanding. "You are the future. You are the cure. I am the toxin. It's my name on the door. It's my hand that must turn the key." He stood up, shedding the oxygen tubes like a snake shedding its skin. For a moment he looked like the titan he once was, but his eyes weren't filled with greed. They were filled with a desperate, final love. "Father, the heat would kill you. Your lungs can't take the vapors." My lungs were already black before I met the virus. I've spent my life building walls. Let me break this one. I watched through the glass, tears blurring my vision, as my father disappeared into the white haze. I heard the sound of metal grinding against metal, a deep, agonizing groan of a machine being forced to stop. Clunk. The humming stopped. The green sludge ceased its bubbling. The robotic arms froze in midair. The silence that followed was more deafening than the roar. I ran into the steam, dragging him out. He was burned, his breathing a shallow, ragged whistle. But as I laid him on the floor, he was smiling. He was looking at a group of workers who had emerged from the lower levels, people who had been trapped in the automated cycle for days. "The machines are dead," he whispered, Let the people live. We carried him out to the van. The East District was still shrouded in smoke, but the source was gone. The shadow legacy of Ethelgard had been physically dismantled by the man who had laid its first stone. "Maya," Arthur said as we drove back to the Gray Zone clinic, "the files in the safe, the blue folder, it's for you. Not assets, not money. Information." Back at the clinic, I opened the folder. It wasn't a bank account. It was a list of every scientist, every researcher, and every doctor who had been fired or blacklisted by Ethelgard over the last 30 years for ethical concerns. "This is the real inheritance," I said, showing it to Marcus. "It's a map of the minds we need to rebuild the world." "But we have no funding, Maya," Marcus said. "The trust is tied up in international courts for years." "We don't need the trust's money," I said, looking at the thousands of people outside who were already starting to clear the sludge from their streets. "We have the factories, we have the people, and we have the one thing Ethelgard never had." "What's that?" "A reason to wake up tomorrow that isn't a dividend."
My dear ones, thank you for listening to this story. It makes me incredibly happy to feel that you are here with me. I try my best for you and post new videos every day, putting a piece of myself into them. If my stories resonate with you, your subscription and viewing of other videos will be the warmest support for me and inspiration to continue telling stories.
The glass shards of the Sterling flagship store were being swept away by the same people who, weeks ago, were treated like vermin in its shadow. The transformation of a corporate empire is a slow, painful process, like a body purging a deep-seated infection. But today, the fever had finally broken. The Sterling Tower was no longer a fortress of patents. It was being renamed the Ethelgard Global Commons. Inside the 80th floor boardroom, where my father had once struck me from his will, I sat at the head of a long wooden table, but the men in tailored suits were gone. In their place sat the blacklisted scientists, the men and women from the blue folder, geneticists from Brazil, chemists from Ukraine, epidemiologists from India, people who had sacrificed their careers for the truth. "The infrastructure is yours," I addressed the room, my voice steady. "The labs, the bioreactors, the distribution networks. But there is one condition. Everything created within these walls must be open source. No patents, no proprietary margins. If we find a cure for cancer, the world owns it. If we develop a better vaccine, it belongs to the child in the slum as much as the billionaire in the penthouse." Outside, the city was celebrating, but inside there was one final task. My father lay in the surgical suite. The V12 and V13 markers were gone, but the structural damage to his nervous system remained. I had developed a final regenerative procedure using stem cell scaffolds, a technique Ethelgard had deemed unprofitable because it was a one-time cure rather than a lifetime treatment. "Are you ready, Father?" I asked, adjusting the overhead surgical lights. "Maya," Arthur whispered, looking at the city below, "I don't deserve this. Give the treatment to someone younger, someone who can do more." "I'm not giving this to you as a gift, Father," I said, prepping the local anesthetic. "I'm giving it to you as a sentence. You're going to live long enough to lead the Restorative Justice Committee. You're the one who explains to the victims' families how the system worked and how we're fixing it. You have a lot of work to do." He smiled, a weak but genuine expression. "Always the liquidator." The surgery took 6 hours. It was the most precise work of my life, a delicate dance of microsutures and protein grafts. When the final monitor stabilized and the neural pathways began to fire with a healthy, rhythmic pulse, I knew we had won. The Pharma King was dead. Arthur Sterling, the public servant, was born. As I walked out of the suite, Marcus Thorne met me with a tablet. The board members who escaped to the Caymans, they've been apprehended. The International Court is using the data from the Archive Collective to seize their personal offshore accounts. Every cent is being diverted to the Global Health Trust. We have enough to fund the Open Science Initiative for the next 50 years. Good, I said, looking at the sunset. And the gray zone? The factories have been converted. They're producing the Anchor series at cost. The infection rate is at 0. I walked to the massive window of the 80th floor. I looked down at the streets. The Grey Guard was still there, but they weren't guarding a clinic anymore. They were protecting a park. The smoke from the East District was gone, replaced by the clear, sharp air of a city that had learned to breathe again. I pulled the old disinheritance agreement from my pocket, the one my father had forced me to sign. I looked at it for a moment, then fed it into the paper shredder. I didn't need a signature to be a Sterling, and I didn't need a fortune to be a doctor. I stepped onto the balcony. A crowd of thousands had gathered below, their faces looking up. I didn't give a speech about profits or growth. I held up a single vial of the clear, universal vaccine we had just finalized. "The science is yours!" I shouted, the speakers carrying my voice across the city. The roar of the people was the only dividend I ever needed. I'm going to end it here. If you've ever realized that the greatest inheritance isn't what you receive, but what you leave for everyone else, then you know why we stayed in the basement. My name is Maya Sterling. The name on the tower is the same, but for the first time in history, it means healing.